Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Chapter 1, The Threshold and the Torrent. No sign hung above the door. If it ever had one, it was long since stolen by time or weather, or perhaps no one ever bothered to carve one in the first place. This particular establishment, nestled deep in the gut of the town like a half-digested secret, didn't need a name painted on a shingle. People found the blackened barrel, as it was grumbled about in alleys and whispered of in marketplaces, the way animals find water in a drought, by instinct, by scent, by the undeniable pull of something vital, something raw and necessary. You'd been walking the narrow, muck-slicked lanes of the lower quarter for nearly an hour, guided by the kind of half-remembered directions and pungent rumors passed between weary traders like suspect coin. The journey was a litany of urban miseries. Past the butcher's shack, a grim tableau where flies clung like a shimmering, buzzing moss to the bloodied, hanging carcasses, their metallic tang a constant assault on your nostrils. Past the smithy, where the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil was a heartbeat in the throat of the street, and the fierce, iron taste of forging heat and quenched metal turned the damp air to a gritty soup that coated your tongue. You'd even passed a stooped woman, her face a roadmap of hard years, selling dubious-looking eels from a slime-coated wooden bucket. She'd offered a gap-toothed, knowing laugh when you asked for a place to find rest and a decent drink. "Follow the noise, traveler," she'd cackled, her voice raspy as a dry corn husk. "And the piss smell. Sharpest on the left wind, that one. You'll find it soon enough, or it'll find you." And, by the saints, she was right. It hit you before you even properly saw the building, a low, guttural roar, not of a single beast, but of a pack. It was like distant thunder, somehow caught and amplified, wrapped in the tattered remnants of song and the thick, wet punctuation of slurred curses. The kind of complex, layered sound that can only emanate from a congregation of men half full of potent drink and entirely empty of worldly caution or polite restraint. Then, closer, the smell, not sharp initially, but thick, heavy, almost a living entity in the air. It was an ancient perfume, the acrid bite of wood smoke, the sweet-sour breath of cheap ale, the damp, earthy scent of wet wool from cloaks still steaming from the evening mist, and, underpinning it all, the slow, pervasive rot of straw that had been soaked through with a dozen nights' worth of spillage, vomit, and untold secrets. It was a scent that didn't just enter your nostrils, it crawled into your lungs, settled in your clothes, and sent a primal message to your weary body: you're close. This was the aroma of congregation, of crude comfort, of life lived at its loudest and often its lowest. The building itself, when you finally identified it by the sheer density of these sensory assaults, leaned like an old, sodden drunkard into the begrudging support of its equally dilapidated neighbor. It was squat, hunched beneath a thatched roof that was more patched than original straw, looking as if a giant had sat on it and forgotten to get up. The timber frame, dark with age and grime, sagged noticeably at the joints, like the tired limbs of an ancient creature. Moss, a vibrant, unhealthy green, crept over its stone base like a slow, inexorable tide. Its door, the very portal that lent the place its unspoken name in your mind, was of blackened oak, thick and formidable. It was worn smooth and slightly concave in the middle, a testament to the thousands of hands that had pushed their way in seeking solace or trouble, and the undoubtedly fewer who had stumbled out with any semblance of dignity. No friendly candle lit the threshold. No welcoming window glowed with warm invitation. Just the faintest, almost imperceptible glimmer of firelight, the color of old amber, seeping from between warped boards near the doorframe. A weak pulse in the surrounding gloom. It was less an invitation, more a grudging admission of existence. You stood for a long moment, the damp chill of the encroaching night seeping into your bones, a stark contrast to the implied heat within. The muffled cacophony, bursts of laughter, the distinct scrape and creak of benches on a rough floor, a sudden, sharp shout followed by a dull thud, leaked out around the door's ill fit. Your worn leather boots sank a little deeper into the viscous mud of the unpaved alley as you took a final, bracing step forward. The air here was thick enough to chew, a miasma of refuse, damp earth, and the promise of human effluvia. And then, with one deep, preparatory breath held tight in your chest and one determined push against the stubborn wood, you opened the door. The world inside didn't just greet you, it swallowed you whole. Warmth struck first, a sudden, thick, almost obscene wave of it, a physical blow after the biting cold of the street you'd just abandoned. It was the kind of heat born not just of a fire, but of many unwashed bodies crammed into a confined space, of breath and sweat and spilled drink creating a humid microclimate. The air clung to your skin like damp wool, dense and impossibly rich with a new, intensified tapestry of smells, the omnipresent wood smoke, yes, but now sharper, mingled with the fatty sizzle of roasting meat, the yeasty tang of fermenting ale right from the barrel, the sourness of old wine, the unmistakable musk of human sweat, potent and unmasked, and something else, something vaguely metallic and unsettling, perhaps old bloodstains on the floorboards that never quite washed away. Shadows, long and grotesque, danced and writhed on the low-beamed ceiling, contorting with every flicker and flare of the logs crackling and spitting in a broad, deep hearth that dominated the far wall. The light, what there was of it, was a murky, bruised amber, stained by generations of accumulated soot on the walls and rafters, casting everything in a dramatic, almost infernal glow. It caught the sheen of grease on rough-hewn wooden tables, the glint of moisture on overflowing tankards, the sharp angles of wary faces turning momentarily, incuriously, towards the disturbance of your entry. Someone, a bear of a man with a voice like grinding stones, shouted something unintelligible across the room, his words lost in the general din. A scrawny, dirt-caked dog, previously unseen beneath a table, barked once, a short, sharp sound, then was silenced by a swift kick or a muttered curse, and promptly went ignored by the assembly. Somewhere in a dim corner, a hopeful but hopelessly untalented bard plucked haphazardly at a lute, its strings emitting a series of mournful, discordant twangs, entirely out of tune with itself and out of rhythm with the chaotic symphony of the tavern. You stepped inside fully, your boots squelching slightly on something soft and yielding, likely a fresh layer of damp straw strewn over the packed earth floor. The heavy oaken door, groaning like a soul in torment, creaked shut behind you with a ponderous finality, the latch clicking dully into place. It sealed off the cold, the relative quiet, and the thin, indifferent moonlight of the outside world. You were now truly within the belly of the blackened barrel. No one looked up with any sustained interest. No one offered a greeting or a nod of welcome. A few eyes might have flickered over you, a swift, practiced assessment, threat or mark, stranger or familiar sought, before dismissing you as just another piece of driftwood washed in by the evening tide. But you were in. You had crossed the threshold. And in this place, at this hour, that meant everything. The journey was over, the experience was about to begin. Your shoulders, unconsciously hunched against the cold and the uncertainty of the streets, relaxed a fraction. The first task was to see, to truly absorb the scene before you, to find a place within this roiling, breathing organism of wood, smoke, and humanity. The air was thick, yes, but it was also alive. Chapter 2, a tapestry woven of smoke and shadow. Your eyes, still adjusting from the Stygian blackness of the alley, struggled to penetrate the gloom. The primary source of illumination was, indeed, the great hearth. It was a monstrous thing, wide enough to roast an ox, though judging by the modest size of the logs currently burning and the general aroma, its current offerings were likely far humbler. Flames, a hungry orange and yellow, licked greedily at the wood, sending showers of sparks skittering up the blackened chimney breast. This fire cast the most consistent light, painting the nearest tables and faces in a warm, flickering glow, but its reach was limited. Deeper into the room, other, lesser lights battled the encroaching darkness. Tallow candles, thick and sputtering, sat precariously on a few tables, their flames guttering in unseen drafts, casting more smoke than light. They were crude things, likely made from animal fat, and their smell, a greasy, slightly rancid note, added another layer to the already complex olfactory tapestry. Some were stuck into pools of their own melted wax on the wood, others perched in chipped clay saucers. Their light was feeble, creating small islands of visibility in a sea of shadows. Where the firelight and candlelight failed, utter blackness reigned, particularly in the corners and under the low-slung eaves. The ceiling itself was an oppressive presence. Heavy, rough-hewn beams, stained nearly black with centuries of smoke and grime, sagged precariously low. You found yourself instinctively ducking your head slightly, though you were not an unusually tall man. These beams were festooned with cobwebs thick as funeral shrouds, swaying gently in the currents of warm air. Here and there, something, a forgotten strip of leather, a dried herb, perhaps even a mummified rat, hung limply from a nail hammered haphazardly into the wood. The walls, where visible between the shadows and the throng, were a patchwork of daub and wattle, equally stained, and in places, crumbling. Crude drawings, scratched into the plaster or daubed with charcoal, depicted lewd figures, unfinished games of noughts and crosses, and perhaps the names of long-forgotten debtors or sweethearts. The floor beneath your feet was a revelation of sorts. You'd initially thought it packed earth, and perhaps it once was. But generations of spilled ale, grease, food scraps, and God knows what else, combined with the regularly strewn straw, had compacted into a resilient, slightly springy, and undeniably pungent surface. It was surprisingly effective at muffling footsteps, though it did little to absorb the smells. The straw, a pale, dirty gold in the firelight, was thickest near the door, presumably to soak up the mud and wet brought in from outside. Deeper in, it was trampled, stained, and mixed with unidentifiable debris. Shadows were not mere absences of light here, they were active participants in the scene. They clung to the recesses of faces, deepening eye sockets, exaggerating cheekbones, turning a grin into a grimace and a frown into a terrifying mask. They stretched and shrank with the flickering of the flames, making stationary objects seem to writhe and breathe. A stack of barrels in a far corner became a looming, monstrous beast. A cloak slung over a bench could be a sleeping man or something far more sinister. This interplay of light and shadow created an atmosphere of constant, subtle movement, a visual restlessness that mirrored the human chaos within. The air, as you drew it deeper into your lungs, felt almost solid. It was warm, yes, but also heavy, humid, and thick with particulates. You could taste the smoke on the back of your tongue, not the clean scent of a forest campfire, but the greasy, acrid smoke of burning fat and cheap wood. There was a distinct metallic tang, too, faint but persistent, perhaps from rusty fittings, or more likely, from the sheer volume of cheap iron tankards constantly being refilled and slammed down. The stickiness you'd felt on the door lingered in the atmosphere, a promise of surfaces coated in a fine patina of ancient grime and spilled potables. You imagined running a hand along a tabletop and it coming away tacky, bearing the history of 1,000 prior encounters. Even before you thought of ordering. Certain tastes formed in your mind, conjured by the potent suggestions of the air. The sharp, slightly sour tang of ale, unfiltered and likely served at room temperature, the kind that sat heavy in the gut. The earthy, almost gamey flavor of a slow-cooked pottage, rich with root vegetables and whatever scraps of meat had been available that day. The dense, chewy crumb of dark, coarse bread, perfect for soaking up gravy or ale, but likely stale around the edges. These were not flavors of refinement, but of sustenance, of necessity, of a world where flavor was a robust, often harsh, declaration rather than a subtle whisper. You began to look for a place to settle, your eyes scanning the crowded room. The layout of the blackened barrel was as haphazard as its construction. There was no clear division of zones, no roped-off areas for a particular clientele. It was a single, large, roughly rectangular space, albeit one interrupted by supporting posts that seemed to grow organically from the floor. The bar, if such a grand term could be applied, appeared to be a series of stout, dark-stained planks laid across several upright barrels near one end of the room, not far from a secondary, smaller door that probably led to a storage area or a scullery. Behind this makeshift counter, a figure moved, indistinct in the gloom for now. Tables were scattered throughout the room, none of them matching. Some were long, rough-hewn trestle tables, clearly designed for communal seating, already groaning under the weight of elbows, tankards, and slumped bodies. Others were smaller, more rickety affairs, perhaps salvaged from elsewhere, with uneven legs that made them wobble precariously. Benches, equally varied in design and states of disrepair, flanked the longer tables. A few three-legged stools, looking as if they might collapse at any moment, were crammed into tighter spaces. There were no comfortable chairs, no cushions, nothing to encourage lingering beyond the call of thirst or company. The great hearth, naturally, was a focal point. Several benches were drawn up close to its warmth, occupied by figures who seemed almost to be roasting themselves along with whatever was cooking. This was prime territory, likely claimed early and defended jealously. Further back, in the deeper shadows along the walls, were darker corners, recesses where deals might be struck in hushed tones, or where those wishing for a modicum of privacy, or anonymity, could retreat. But even these spaces were not truly secluded. The press of bodies and the sheer volume of noise ensured that everything felt, to some extent, public. You spotted a small gap on a bench near the end of a long table, midway between the fire and the bar. It was not ideal, you'd have neighbors pressed close on either side, but it offered a vantage point from which to observe the room more fully. Taking a breath, you began to weave your way through the throng. The air grew thicker with human proximity, the scent of unwashed bodies and stale breath becoming more pronounced. You sidestepped a sprawling pair of legs, narrowly avoided an erratically gesturing arm holding a sloshing tankard, and squeezed past a group engaged in a loud, incomprehensible argument. The floor was indeed treacherous, sticky in places, and littered with unseen obstacles. Finally, you reached the offered space. A cursory glance at your potential neighbors, one a heavily bearded man seemingly asleep with his head on the table, the other a wiry fellow muttering into his drink, suggested they would not be overly concerned by your arrival. With a grunt that was lost in the general din, you eased yourself onto the hard, slightly damp wood of the bench. It was, as expected, uncomfortable. But you were seated. You were, for the moment, part of the tapestry. Now, to unravel its threads, Chapter 3, The Cast of the Cauldron. From your precarious perch on the bench, the chaotic theater of the blackened barrel began to resolve itself into individual actors, each playing their part in this nightly drama of drink, desperation, and fleeting camaraderie. The first figure to truly solidify from the smoky miasma was, inevitably, the one who presided over the flow of liquid solace. The tavern keeper. He, for it was unmistakably he, stood behind the plank and barrel counter, a man built on a scale commensurate with the establishment itself. He wasn't merely large, he seemed carved from the same gnarled, resilient timber as the tavern's beams. His shoulders were broad enough to block the light from a small window, and his belly strained impressively against a greasy leather apron that had seen countless spills and wiped hands. His face, caught intermittently in the flickering light from a nearby candle stub, was a landscape of hard living, a nose broken at least once, now skewed slightly to the left, a web of deep-set wrinkles around his eyes that could have been from laughter or perpetual squinting into the smoky dimness, and a jaw that looked capable of cracking nutshells or skulls with equal indifference. His hair, what little remained, was a grizzled gray, plastered to his scalp with sweat. He moved with a surprising economy of motion for a man his size, his hands, thick as hams, darting out to snatch empty tankards, wiped down the perpetually sticky counter with a filthy rag, and, most importantly, worked the spigots of the barrels behind him. There were perhaps 3 or 4 such barrels visible, presumably holding different brews of ale, or perhaps cider. He didn't smile. He didn't engage in idle chatter. His interactions were brutally efficient, a grunt in response to a shouted order, a swift filling of a mug, a slam of the vessel onto the counter, and an expectant, unblinking stare until coin, or the promise of it, was forthcoming. He was the unquestioned monarch of this grimy kingdom, his authority absolute, maintained not by charm but by sheer physical presence and an air of weary cynicism that suggested he'd seen and heard everything humanity had to offer, and none of it impressed him. You saw him, on one occasion, reach under the counter and produce a short, thick club, a persuader, no doubt, when a dispute over payment threatened to escalate. The mere sight of it was enough to quell the argument. He had no visible helpers, at least not behind the counter. This was his domain, and he ruled it alone. You heard someone call him Boren, though whether that was a name or a description, you couldn't yet tell. The patrons themselves were a motley, shifting tapestry, a cross-section of the lower rungs of medieval society, with a few surprising threads woven in. Closest to the fire, predictably, were the peasants and local laborers. Their faces were ruddy from outdoor work and now flushed deeper by the ale and the hearth's heat. Their clothes were coarse, patched homespun, still carrying the scent of the fields, the stables, or the workshop. They talked loudly, their dialect thick and often difficult to follow, their laughter booming and uninhibited. Their hands, gnarled and calloused, gripped their wooden or clay mugs with a desperate possessiveness. For them, the blackened barrel was clearly an escape, a brief respite from a life of unrelenting toil and little reward. Mingling amongst them, though often keeping slightly to themselves, were a few soldiers. You could tell them by their bearing, even out of armor, a certain straightness of the back, a watchfulness in their eyes that never quite dimmed, even when drink fuddled their senses. Some wore faded tunics bearing the crest of a local lord, others seemed to be mercenaries between contracts, their leather jerkins scarred and well-worn. They drank with a grim determination, their conversations often punctuated by harsh, mirthless laughter or sudden, brooding silences. They were a potentially volatile element, you sensed, quick to anger and accustomed to violence. Here and there, you spotted merchants, or at least men who carried themselves with the air of those who dealt in trade. They were generally better dressed than the peasants, perhaps in dyed wool or even a bit of worn velvet. They tended to cluster in small groups, their heads bent together, their voices lower, discussing prices, routes, and undoubtedly, the latest gossip from distant towns. For them, the tavern was a place of business as much as pleasure, a neutral ground for striking deals and gathering intelligence. You saw one such man discreetly pass a small pouch to another, their hands meeting briefly under the table. A surprising sight, though perhaps it shouldn't have been, was the occasional presence of a monk. Not the austere, contemplative sort, but rather a fleshy, red-faced friar, his robes stained with ale and food. One such individual sat not far from you, his laughter as loud as any peasant's, his hand straying perhaps a little too familiarly towards the arm of a serving girl as she passed. These were the wanderers, the preachers of dubious orthodoxy, perhaps, who found the tavern's rough hospitality more congenial than a cold monastery cell. They were often skilled storytellers, their repertoire ranging from bawdy tales to embellished saints' lives, and they could usually command a drink or two in exchange for their entertainment. Travelers, like yourself, were sprinkled throughout the crowd. You could often spot them by their slightly bewildered expressions, their eyes constantly scanning the unfamiliar surroundings, or by the presence of a travel-stained pack or bundle tucked beneath their bench. They tended to be more circumspect, observing more than participating, at least initially. Each arrival of a new face at the door prompted a brief, assessing glance from these itinerants, a flicker of shared understanding of being adrift in a strange port. And then there were the women. They were not numerous, but their presence was palpable. A few were clearly tavern staff, sturdy, quick-witted women, their sleeves rolled up, their aprons as soiled as Boren's. They navigated the crowded room with practiced ease, dodging grasping hands, delivering flagons of ale, and collecting empty mugs, their voices sharp and capable of cutting through the din. They endured the crude jests and wandering eyes with a mixture of weary tolerance and sharp-tongued rebuffs. One, a younger woman with fiery red hair and a smattering of freckles, seemed particularly adept at deflecting unwanted advances with a sarcastic quip that often left the offender sputtering. Other women present were less clearly defined in their roles. Some might have been traders themselves, perhaps selling small wares or accompanying merchant husbands. Others, their clothing a little finer, their glances a little more direct, were likely courtesans, plying their ancient trade in the dim corners, their laughter a little too bright, their whispers a little too promising. Their interactions were a complex dance of commerce and desire, played out under the smoky gaze of the tavern. You saw no children, which was perhaps a blessing. This was no place for the young. However, the animal kingdom was well represented. Scrawny dogs, ribs showing through their mangy fur, skulked hopefully beneath the tables, their eyes fixed on any falling scrap or carelessly held piece of bread. They were a common fixture, tolerated as living refuse disposals. You even saw, with some surprise, a chicken pecking its way nonchalantly across the floor near the entrance, seemingly unfazed by the chaos, before disappearing into the shadows near the back. The sounds from outside, the occasional braying of a donkey, the distant lowing of cattle from a nearby pen, sometimes filtered in when the door opened, a reminder that the tavern, for all its human intensity, was still embedded in a world where animals were an inescapable part of daily life. Your neighbor, the bearded man, snorted loudly in his sleep, his head lolling. The wiry man beside him continued his murmured monologue, occasionally punctuating it with a violent swig from his tankard. The sheer density of life, of stories unheard and dramas unfolding, was almost overwhelming. Each face held a history, each muttered conversation a fragment of a larger narrative. The Blackened Barrel was not just a building, it was a cauldron, constantly simmering with the passions, fears, hopes, and desperations of all who sought refuge or release within its smoky embrace. You were just one more ingredient, now added to the potent brew. Chapter 4, the bitter draught and the humble crumb. The dull ache in your stomach, a companion throughout the latter part of your journey, now made its presence known more insistently. The aromas of roasting meat, however faint and mingled with less savory scents, had stirred your appetite. And thirst, of course, was the primary reason for seeking out such an establishment in the first place. It was time to engage with the offerings of the Blackened Barrel. There was, naturally, no menu. No neatly chalked board listed the day's specials, no solicitous server inquired after your preferences. You knew the drill, you listened, you watched, and you made your inquiry directly, likely to the formidable Boren himself or one of his tireless serving women. Your gaze swept the room again, trying to discern what others were consuming. Tankards were ubiquitous, mostly of dark, roughly glazed clay or battered pewter, though some of the poorer patrons drank from simple wooden mugs, little more than hollowed-out sections of branches. The liquid within was invariably a murky brown or amber, ale, almost certainly. You saw no one drinking water, and for good reason. In a town of this size and sanitation, water from wells or cisterns was often a gamble, a potential carrier of sickness. Ale, with its boiled ingredients and fermentation, was the safer, if not always wiser, choice. You watched one of the serving women, the red-haired one you'd noted earlier, deliver a steaming bowl to a table near the hearth. It was pottage, the eternal stew of the common folk, a thick, glutinous concoction of unidentifiable vegetables and, if one was lucky, a few scraps of meat or bone for flavor. It was the smell of this that had been teasing your nostrils, earthy, slightly peppery, with a hint of onion. Nearby, a man gnawed on a hunk of dark bread, tearing at it with his teeth. Another was meticulously picking meat from a bone with his knife, the grease glistening on his fingers. Cheese, pale and crumbly, also made an appearance on a few tables, often shared amongst a group. Catching the eye of the red-haired woman as she passed, a feat in itself amidst the clamor, you raised a hand. She paused, her expression neutral, one hand on her hip, the other still holding an empty flagon. "Ale," you said, your voice raspy from disuse and the smoky air. "And whatever food you have that's hot." She gave a curt nod, her gaze lingering on you for a fraction of a second, perhaps sizing you up, before she turned and headed towards the bar area. There was no pleasantry, no coming right up. Efficiency was the watchword. The wait was not overly long, perhaps due to the simplicity of the request. Soon, she returned, navigating the throng with the same practiced agility. In one hand, she carried a clay tankard, filled almost to the brim with a dark, frothy liquid. In the other, a small, shallow wooden bowl, from which steam still rose. She set them down on the table in front of you with a thud that sloshed a little ale over the side. "That'll be 2 pennies for the lot," she said, her voice surprisingly clear and strong above the din. Her eyes, a startling green in the dim light, met yours directly. You fumbled in the small pouch at your belt, extracting the coins. Her fingers, surprisingly nimble and clean despite her work, plucked them from your palm. Without another word, she was gone, swallowed back into the swirling currents of the tavern. You picked up the tankard. It was cool to the touch, the clay slightly rough. The ale within was, as expected, unfiltered. Tiny particles of sediment swirled at the bottom, and the head was a loose, brownish foam. You brought it to your lips. The first taste was robust, slightly sweet initially, then followed by a distinct bitterness from the hops, or whatever bittering herbs had been used. It was definitely warm, or rather, cellar temperature, not chilled in any modern sense. There was a yeasty, almost bready flavor to it, and it was undeniably strong. It wasn't fine ale, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it was honest and potent, and it immediately began to soothe the dryness in your throat and the weariness in your limbs. Next, you turned your attention to the bowl. The pottage was thick, almost a paste. You could make out chunks of carrot, turnip, and perhaps some parsnip, all boiled to a soft mush. There were a few stringy pieces of what might have been mutton or old goat, and a scattering of barley grains. The broth itself was savory, well salted, and surprisingly flavorful, likely thanks to a long, slow simmer with bones and whatever herbs were on hand. You had no spoon. Looking around, you saw most patrons either drinking the pottage directly from their bowls or using chunks of bread to scoop it up. A few, like the man with the bone, employed their personal knives. You had your own dagger at your belt, a utilitarian tool for eating as much as for defense. Drawing it, you used the tip to spear some eatables and convey them to your mouth. The food was coarse, simple, and utterly devoid of elegance. Yet, it was hot, filling, and deeply satisfying. The warmth spread through your belly, a welcome sensation against the lingering chill that clung to your clothes. The bread, when you eventually managed to flag down the serving woman again to purchase a hunk, was indeed dark, dense, and slightly stale, with a chewy crust. It was perfect for mopping up the last of the pottage, its blandness a good counterpoint to the stew's robust flavor. Eating with your knife and fingers was the norm here. Table manners, as understood in more refined circles, were entirely absent. Men wiped greasy hands on their tunics or on the straw-strewn floor. They belched loudly and without apology. They spoke with their mouths full, sending sprays of food across the table. It was a primal act of refueling, undertaken with a gusto that bordered on the aggressive. You ate slowly, observing, taking small sips of the strong ale between mouthfuls of pottage. The process of ordering and receiving was a microcosm of the tavern's overall ethos, direct, unadorned, and transactional. There was no pretense, no attempt to impress. You stated your need, you paid your due, you received your goods. It was a harsh reality, perhaps, but an honest one. The blackened barrel offered no illusions, only the stark provision of basic human requirements: drink to dull the senses, food to fill the belly, and a temporary, if chaotic, shelter from the world outside. And in that, there was a strange kind of integrity. The ale might be cloudy and the pottage humble, but they were real, and for a weary traveler in a hard world, that was often more than enough. Chapter 5, the raucous chorus of the common room. As the ale began to warm your blood and the food settled in your stomach, the raw sensory input of the blackened barrel started to coalesce into a more discernible, if still utterly chaotic, pattern. The dominant feature, even above the smoke and the smells, was the noise. It was a physical presence, a relentless barrage that vibrated in your chest and hummed in your bones. It wasn't a single sound, but a thick, complex stew of them, constantly shifting and bubbling. Conversations, shouted to be heard over the general din, formed the base layer. These were not polite discussions, they were declarations, arguments, boasts, and lamentations, all delivered at maximum volume. You strained to catch snippets, fragments of lives laid bare. Two men near the bar were engaged in a heated debate about the prowess of a local wrestler, their voices rising with each pint consumed, their gestures becoming increasingly expansive and threatening. Further away, a group of peasants guffawed at a joke so crude it made even your worldly ears tingle, their laughter exploding like sudden bursts of thunder. A lone man in a corner mumbled tearfully into his ale, his grief a small, pathetic counterpoint to the surrounding revelry. Arguments were as common as spilled ale. They flared up suddenly, often over trivial matters, a perceived slight, a disputed debt of a single copper, the merits of one lord over another, or simply the belligerent consequence of too much drink. Most were verbal battles, loud and blustery, full of impressive curses and dire threats that rarely materialized into actual violence. You saw one such spat, two wiry fellows, faces inches apart, voices cracking with rage, swearing oaths upon their mothers' graves and the bones of saints. It seemed certain to come to blows, but then one of Boren's serving women, the red-haired one again, interposed herself with a sharp command and a strategically placed tray, and the confrontation fizzled out into grumbling and muttered resentments. Boren himself rarely intervened unless things threatened to damage his property or seriously disrupt his trade. A certain level of boisterousness was expected, even encouraged. Overlaying the conversations were the songs. These were rarely harmonious. More often than not, a single, usually drunken, voice would rise in a quavering, off-key rendition of a popular ballad or a bawdy-drinking chant. Sometimes, others would join in, creating a ragged, enthusiastic chorus that was more noise than music. The bard in the corner, the one with the perpetually out-of-tune lute, continued his valiant but largely ignored efforts. His melodies were simple, his voice thin, and his repertoire seemed limited to mournful dirges about lost love and heroic deeds of dubious authenticity. Occasionally, a coin or two would be tossed his way, more out of pity or a desire to change the tune than genuine appreciation. His music was just another thread in the sonic tapestry, often drowned out but stubbornly persistent. The clinking and clattering of mugs was a constant percussion. Pewter thudded heavily on wood, clay clinked more sharply. Spoons, where used, scraped against a few bowls. Dice, too, added their distinct rattle to the mix. In a shadowy alcove not far from your table, a group of men were hunched over a game, their faces intense in the flickering candlelight. You could hear the dry click-clack of bone dice shaken in a leather cup, followed by muttered curses or triumphant shouts. The stakes were probably small, a few copper coins, perhaps another round of ale, but the tension around the game was palpable. You saw a glint of silver change hands, a rare sight. Cheating, you had no doubt, was a constant risk, and disputes over dice could turn ugly faster than almost anything else in a tavern. The animal contributions continued, the occasional disgruntled bark from a kicked dog, the scuffling of unseen paws, and, surprisingly, from somewhere near the back, the indignant squawk of what sounded very much like a goose, perhaps disturbed in its slumber or protesting its confinement. These sounds blended seamlessly with the human cacophony, a reminder of the close quarters shared by man and beast. Even the inanimate objects seemed to contribute to the noise. Benches creaked and groaned under shifting weights. The great oaken door complained loudly each time it was opened or closed, admitting a fresh blast of cold air and a momentary shift in the acoustic landscape. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, a steady, rhythmic undertone to the more erratic human sounds. Flirting, if such a delicate term could be applied, was a blunt and direct affair. A rough hand on a serving woman's arm, a lewd comment whispered, or shouted, as she passed, a bold stare that lingered too long. The responses varied, a sharp retort, a practiced ignore, or, occasionally, a coy smile if the attention was welcome or potentially profitable. You saw a burly soldier attempting to woo one of the serving women with a clumsy compliment and an offer of a drink. She accepted the drink with a wry smile but deftly evaded his attempt to pull her onto his lap, moving on to her next task with a knowing glance back. Romance, in the blackened barrel, was likely a swift, transactional, and probably regrettable encounter in a dark corner or a hastily rented upstairs room, if such luxuries existed. The overall effect was one of overwhelming, immersive sound. It wasn't just loud, it was thick. It pressed in on you from all sides, a living entity. There was no quiet corner, no escape from the relentless tide of noise. Yet, after a while, it began to take on a strange sort of normalcy. Your ears, initially assaulted, started to filter, to pick out individual strands from the tangled skein. You found yourself almost unconsciously tapping your foot to the ragged rhythm of a particularly enthusiastic, if tuneless, song. The background hum became just that, a background, against which the smaller dramas of the tavern played out. It was the heartbeat of the place, wild and irregular, but undeniably alive. And in its own way, there was a strange comfort in it, a sense of being enveloped in a shared, raucous humanity, a temporary suspension of the silence and solitude that often waited outside the tavern door. Chapter 6, The Shadow of the Brawl and the Keeper's Peace. The ale, potent as it was, had a cumulative effect. As the evening wore on and more tankards were emptied, the general level of conviviality began to fray at the edges, replaced by a more volatile, unpredictable energy. Laughter became louder, more forced. Voices grew sharper. Arguments more pointed. The air, already thick, seemed to crackle with a latent tension. It was the inevitable progression of a night in a place like the Blackened Barrel, the slow slide from boisterous camaraderie towards potential chaos. A brawl, you sensed, was not a matter of if, but when. You saw the first signs brewing at a table across the room, occupied by a group of what looked like out-of-work laborers or perhaps low-grade mercenaries. They had been drinking steadily since your arrival, their voices growing progressively louder and their boasts more outrageous. The dispute, as far as you could gather from the slurred shouts, seemed to revolve around a shared skin of cheap wine they'd been passing around, and whether one particular fellow, a lanky, red-faced man with shifty eyes, had taken more than his fair share. You swillied it like a pig at the trough, Jorn, accused a stocky man with a heavily scarred cheek. His fist, already clenched, thumped the table, making the tankards jump. I took no more than any other. Jorn slurred back, his chin jutting out pugnaciously. Your eyes are addled by the drink, Finn. The argument escalated quickly. Insults were exchanged, parentage questioned, and personal honor, however tattered, fiercely defended. Their companions, initially trying to mediate, soon began to take sides, their own voices rising in support of their chosen champion. The atmosphere around their table became charged, a pocket of focused aggression in the wider chaos. Other conversations nearby quieted slightly, heads turning, sensing the shift in mood. This was a different kind of entertainment, one with higher stakes. The flashpoint came when Finn, the scarred man, made a sudden lunge across the table, attempting to grab Jorn by the collar. Jorn, surprisingly agile for his drunken state, lurched backward, his stool scraping loudly as it tipped over. He came up sputtering, his face contorted with rage. You dare lay hands on me, you ale-sodden lout, he roared, though his voice cracked slightly. And then it began. Not with a clean punch, but with a clumsy, flailing shove from Finn. Jorn stumbled back, knocking into another man, who promptly shoved him forward again, deeper into the fray. Suddenly, it was a tangle of limbs, grunts, and curses. Tankards went flying, spraying ale in glittering arcs through the smoky air. A bench overturned with a crash, sending its occupants sprawling. It wasn't a graceful fight. There were no skilled combatants here, no flashing blades, at least, not yet. Knives usually stayed sheathed unless things got truly desperate, as Boren's club was a powerful deterrent against serious bloodshed. It was a messy, undignified scuffle, fueled by alcohol and simmering grievances. Fists flew, mostly missing their mark or landing with dull thuds on shoulders and backs. Men grappled, slipped on the ale-slicked floor, and rolled amongst the scattered straw and debris. The noise was incredible, shouts, grunts of effort, the thud of bodies hitting wood, and the enraged roars of the participants. The rest of the tavern reacted with a mixture of alarm, amusement, and opportunism. Some patrons scrambled to get out of the way, dragging their mugs with them. Others, particularly those at a safe distance, craned their necks, cheering and jeering, laying impromptu bets on the outcome. A few opportunistic souls darted in to snatch up fallen coins or unattended tankards amidst the confusion. The bard, surprisingly, struck up a lively, if still discordant, tune on his lute, as if providing a soundtrack to the mayhem. The dogs, initially startled into a frenzy of barking, now cowered under distant tables or joined in the general excitement, yapping at the edges of the brawl. Through it all, Boren, the tavern keeper, remained remarkably calm. He'd ceased serving for a moment, his massive arms crossed over his chest, watching the unfolding chaos with an expression that was less anger and more weary resignation. This was, you realized, just another Tuesday night for him. He let it play out for a minute or two, perhaps judging the severity, or maybe just waiting for the initial burst of fury to expend itself. When a particularly loud crash indicated that a small table had been demolished, he finally moved. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He simply picked up the thick, well-worn club from under his counter and began to walk, slowly and deliberately, towards the epicenter of the fight. His progress was like that of a ship parting a choppy sea. Patrons instinctively made way for him. He reached the struggling knot of men and, without a word, brought the club down with considerable force onto the nearest tabletop, one that was still standing. The crack echoed through the tavern, momentarily louder than the fight itself. Enough. His voice was a low growl, but it carried an undeniable authority that cut through the drunken rage. The combatants, startled by the sound and the sudden appearance of the tavern keeper, froze mid-grapple. Finn, his face bleeding from a scratch, looked up, his eyes still glazed but with a flicker of apprehension dawning in them. Jorn, pinned beneath another man, ceased his struggles. Boren didn't waste words. Out, he rumbled, gesturing with the club towards the door. Both of ye. And anyone else who wants to join them. There were a few grumbles, a few defiant glares, but no one argued. The sight of Boren, club in hand, his face set like granite, was a powerful deterrent. Finn and Jorn, looking sheepish and disheveled, were hauled to their feet by their now subdued companions. Bruised, bleeding slightly, and covered in spilled ale and straw, they were unceremoniously bundled towards the exit. The door creaked open, admitting a blast of cold night air, and they were pushed out into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind them. Boren surveyed the scene of minor devastation, the overturned bench, the shattered remnants of the small table, the pools of spilled ale. He grunted. Someone clear this mess, he ordered to no one in particular. One of the serving women, the red-haired one, sighed and went to fetch a broom. Another began righting the bench. The tension in the tavern deflated almost instantly. Conversations resumed, albeit at a slightly lower volume initially. Laughter, a little more subdued now, trickled back. The bard, after a brief pause, returned to his mournful ballads. The brawl, like a sudden summer storm, had passed, leaving behind a bit of wreckage and a lingering smell of exertion, but ultimately changing little. Boren returned to his station behind the counter, placing the club back in its accustomed spot. He wiped his hands on his apron and resumed serving as if nothing untoward had happened. His role was clear, he was the enforcer of a very basic kind of peace, a peace sufficient to allow his business to continue. He didn't care about justice or fairness in the disputes, only that they didn't escalate to the point of driving away paying customers or attracting the unwanted attention of the town watch, should such a thing even exist in this quarter. You took another sip of your ale. The brawl had been an almost inevitable element of the tavern experience, a raw outburst of the frustrations and aggressions that simmered beneath the surface of daily life for many of its patrons. It was more noise and bluster than real harm, in this instance at least. It served as a release valve, a crude form of entertainment, and a clear demonstration of the tavern keeper's unshakable authority. The blackened barrel had absorbed the shock, reset itself, and carried on. And the night was still far from over. Chapter 7, As darkness deepens, so does the drink. The ousting of Finn and Jorn acted as a kind of punctuation mark in the evening's proceedings. The initial, boisterous energy of early drinking had crested and broken with the brawl. Now, as true darkness enveloped the world outside and the fire in the hearth burned lower, settling into a bed of glowing embers, a different atmosphere began to permeate the blackened barrel. The noise level, while still substantial, subtly changed its character. The sharp, argumentative shouts became less frequent, replaced by a lower, more sustained hum of conversation, thicker and more slurred. Laughter, when it came, was often a deeper, more guttural rumble, or a sudden, high-pitched cackle that bordered on the hysterical. The songs grew more maudlin, more sentimental, the tales told by the flickering candlelight leaning towards the melancholic or the boastfully tragic. More drink was consumed, inevitably. The initial thirst-quenching Alesh gave way to a more determined, methodical intake. Tankards were refilled with greater frequency. Borin, his earlier intervention seemingly forgotten by the patrons, worked with a steady, almost mechanical rhythm, his face impassive. You saw him occasionally dilute a brew with a ladleful of water from a bucket under the counter, a common practice to stretch supplies or perhaps to temper the more aggressive drunks, though none seemed to notice or care. The quality of the ale, never high to begin with, likely deteriorated as the night wore on, the dregs of the barrels being tapped. The candlelight, already meager, seemed to shrink further, the sputtering flames casting longer, more distorted shadows. Faces in the gloom became harder to distinguish, morphing into shadowy caricatures. The corners of the room receded into near total blackness, places where figures could slump into oblivion or engage in furtive transactions with even less chance of observation. The air grew heavier, saturated with the exhalations of so many drinkers, the smoke from the dying fire, and the stale, sweetish aroma of spilled alcohol. The patrons, too, were changing. Those with homes to go to, or with a modicum of sense remaining, had already begun to depart, slipping out into the night in twos and threes, their farewells often loud and unsteady. Their departure left more space, but the remaining crowd seemed to sink deeper into their seats, into their cups, into the tavern's embrace. These were the dedicated drinkers, the ones with nowhere else to be, or perhaps, nowhere else they wanted to be. The merchant types had mostly gone, their business concluded. The few soldiers who remained were either slumped in drunken stupors or engaged in low, intense conversations, their earlier boisterousness replaced by a brooding quiet. The peasants and laborers, their brief escape from toil drawing to a close, clung to their last dregs of ale, their faces etched with a weary resignation. New arrivals were infrequent now, usually solitary figures stumbling in from the dark, seeking a final drink or a place to weather the coldest hours of the night. They were greeted with little interest, simply absorbed into the dim, pulsating organism of the tavern. The bard, remarkably resilient, still plucked at his lute, though his melodies were now almost exclusively dirges, his voice hoarse and cracking. He seemed to be playing more for himself than for any audience, a lonely musician serenading the encroaching shadows. Gambling continued in its designated corner, but the stakes seemed lower, the players more bleary-eyed, their movements slower. The sharp click of dice was less frequent, interspersed with longer periods of silence or mumbled disputes settled with a weary shrug rather than a fist. The serving women, their energy seemingly inexhaustible, continued their rounds, though their steps were perhaps a little heavier, their faces showing the strain of the long evening. The red-haired woman, you noticed, now carried a small, flickering oil lamp on some of her trips to the darker tables, its tiny flame a brave beacon in the gloom. She exchanged fewer words, her interactions becoming purely functional. The passage of time became fluid, indistinct. Minutes stretched into an eternity, or hours compressed into a fleeting moment. The outside world, with its concerns and its routines, faded into irrelevance. There was only the dim light, the thick air, the taste of ale, and the low, collective murmur of the remaining souls in the blackened barrel. You found yourself nursing your own tankard, refilled once since your meal. The initial potent kick of the ale had subsided into a dull warmth, a pleasant fuzziness that softened the hard edges of the bench and the harsh realities of the world. Your thoughts, like the conversations around you, became less focused, drifting aimlessly. You watched a beetle laboriously crawl across the sticky tabletop, a tiny drama's unfolding in a universe of spilt drink. You observed a man trying, with comical ineptitude, to light his pipe from a sputtering candle, nearly setting his beard alight in the process. There was a peculiar intimacy to this late-hour tavern scene. The earlier boisterousness had been a performance, a display for others. Now, with fewer witnesses and inhibitions lowered by drink, a more vulnerable, unvarnished humanity emerged. Men spoke of their fears, their regrets, their fleeting hopes, their voices thick with emotion. Others simply sat in silence, lost in their own thoughts, the shared presence of fellow drinkers a bulwark against the loneliness of the night. The blackened barrel, in these deepening hours, transformed. It was less a place of raucous entertainment and more a refuge, a sanctuary of sorts. A place where the burdens of the day could be temporarily set aside, where the harsh glare of reality was softened by shadow and ale, and where, for a few fleeting hours, one could simply be, without judgment or expectation. The raw, unrefined heart of the tavern beat slower now, but with a deeper, more resonant pulse. It was drawing its patrons down, into the dregs of the night, and the dregs of themselves. Chapter 8, The Question of Quarter and the Promise of Straw. As the night deepened into its blackest hours, the tavern thinned out further, but a core of determined lingerers remained. These were the truly committed, or perhaps the truly desperate, those for whom the blackened barrel was not just a stop, but a destination, possibly even a temporary home. The question of lodging, which had been a distant thought earlier, now became more pertinent for those, like yourself, who had no other roof to seek. You had heard whispers, seen suggestive glances towards a narrow, shadowed doorway near the back, almost hidden behind a stack of empty casks. A crude wooden staircase, barely wide enough for one person, ascended steeply from it into the even deeper gloom of an upper floor. This, presumably, was where the blackened barrel offered its version of accommodation. The rooms, if they even merited such a title, were likely to be grim. Shared spaces, almost certainly, with patrons packed in like salted fish in a barrel. Straw mattresses, thin and rustling, laid out on the floorboards, probably teeming with fleas and other unwelcome bedfellows. Privacy would be non-existent, the air thick with the snores, coughs, and nocturnal mutterings of strangers. Security would be a matter of vigilance and luck, any valuables would need to be kept close, perhaps even slept upon. Yet, for a few pennies, it offered a horizontal surface and shelter from the elements, which was more than could be said for a doorway in a windswept alley. You saw a couple of the remaining patrons, their eyes heavy-lidded and their movements unsteady, make their way towards that shadowed staircase. One fumbled for coins, exchanging them with Boren, who merely grunted and jerked his thumb upwards. There was no key, no formal check-in. Payment granted access, nothing more. For those unwilling or unable to pay even the modest price for an upstairs spot, other options existed, albeit less comfortable. Some of the truly inebriated had already succumbed, slumped over tables, their heads pillowed on their arms, snoring lustily, oblivious to the world. Others, with a bit more foresight or perhaps just a higher tolerance for discomfort, sought out relatively sheltered spots on the floor. A space beneath a sturdy table, offering some protection from stray kicks and spills, was prime real estate. A corner, out of the main thoroughfares, was also desirable. You saw one man carefully arrange a small pile of straw near the dying embers of the hearth, curling up like a dog, his cloak pulled tight around him. The feeling of safety, or lack thereof, was a tangible presence in the late-night tavern. While Boren's authority kept outright banditry at bay within the main room, the upstairs warren or the dark corners held an unknown potential for petty theft or worse. Everyone was, to some extent, on their guard. Men slept with one hand on their purse or their knife. The few remaining women, if they weren't staff, either departed with a chosen companion or huddled together for mutual protection. The sounds of the night within the tavern were a muted continuation of the evening symphony, now played pianissimo. The occasional loud snore would rip through the relative quiet. A muttered curse from a troubled sleeper. The rustle of straw as someone shifted position. From upstairs, you might hear the creak of floorboards, a muffled cough, perhaps even the faint sounds of amorous activity, stripped of all romance by proximity and circumstance. You weighed your own options. The thought of the cramped, flea-ridden conditions upstairs was unappealing. Sleeping on a bench, bolt upright, promised a stiff neck and a sore back. The floor, while offering the chance to stretch out, was undeniably filthy and offered little comfort. However, the cost of an upstairs spot, however meager, was still a cost. Your gaze fell upon a relatively empty stretch of bench further down your table, near a supporting pillar. If you could claim that, perhaps lean against the pillar, it might offer a modicum of support. It wouldn't be restful, but it would be something. As if sensing your intention, or perhaps just reaching his own limit, the wiry man who had been muttering beside you finally gave a great, shuddering sigh and slumped forward, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. He was out for the count. Your other neighbor, the bearded man, had been deeply asleep for hours. This cleared a little more space. You shifted, carefully, testing the stability of the bench. It held. The tavern was now quiet enough that individual sounds stood out, the drip of a leaking spigot behind the bar, the sigh of the wind against the ill-fitting shutters over the small, grime-caked windows, covered with what looked like greased animal hide or thick, oiled cloth rather than glass, the distant howl of a dog in the sleeping town. The red-haired serving woman was making a final sweep, collecting empty tankards with a weary air. Boren was methodically dousing some of the remaining candles, plunging the room into even deeper shadow, leaving only the dull red glow of the hearth embers and a single, smoky tallow dip near his counter. The message was clear, the night's business was winding down. You pulled your cloak tighter around you, settling your back against the rough wood of the pillar. The ale had left a dull throb in your temples, and your muscles ached from the day's travel and the hard bench. Sleep, true sleep, seemed unlikely. But perhaps a few hours of fitful dozing was possible. The blackened barrel, in its nocturnal phase, was a repository for the weary, the lost, and the inebriated. It offered a grudging, uncomfortable sanctuary, a place to pass the dark hours until the dawn brought with it the necessity of facing the world anew. You closed your eyes, listening to the chorus of snores and the faint rustlings of the other nightbound souls sharing this smoky, shadowed space. Safety was relative, comfort a distant dream, but for now, you were sheltered. And in the depths of a medieval night, that was a small mercy. Chapter 9, the grey light of morning and the stirring of ashes. Sleep, when it finally came, was a shallow, troubled affair. It was less a plunge into oblivion and more a murky wading through fragmented dreams, punctuated by the cacophony of the tavern's nocturnal life. A sudden, explosive snore from the bearded man beside you, jolting you awake. The scrape of a boot as someone stumbled towards the privy, likely a foul-smelling outhouse in a yard behind the building. The persistent, maddening itch of what you fervently hoped was just a stray piece of straw, but feared was something more animate. Each creak of the timbers, each sigh of the wind outside, seemed amplified in the pre-dawn stillness. The grey light of morning, when it began to seep through the cracks in the shutters and the grime-caked window coverings, was not a cheerful herald of a new day. It was a pale, reluctant infiltration, revealing the previous night's excesses in stark, unflattering detail. The tavern, stripped of the forgiving shadows and the boisterous energy of the evening, looked even more dilapidated and squalid. You opened your eyes slowly, a dull ache behind them, your mouth tasting like the bottom of Boren's oldest ale barrel. Your neck was stiff from leaning against the pillar, and every muscle protested as you cautiously straightened up. The air was cold now, the fire in the hearth long dead, reduced to a pile of grey ashes and a few blackened, unburnt log ends. A chill draft snaked across the floor, carrying with it the stale, compounded smells of old smoke, spilled drink, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely sour that hinted at nocturnal mishaps. The floor was a disaster. Straw, once golden, was now trampled flat, stained dark in patches, and littered with an assortment of debris, a discarded crust of bread, a broken clay pipe stem, a suspiciously damp rag, and countless unidentifiable specks and smears. Overturned stools lay where they had fallen. The remnants of the broken table from the brawl had been shoved into a corner, a testament to last night's brief fury. Who was left? Not many. The bearded man beside you was still dead to the world, his snores now a rhythmic, gurgling wheeze. The wiry man had vanished at some point during the night. A few other shadowed forms were still slumped over tables or curled on benches, beginning to stir fitfully as the weak light touched them. From upstairs, you heard a few groans and the heavy thud of feet as the overnight lodgers began their descent. They emerged blinking into the gloom, looking rumpled, bleary-eyed, and universally unrefreshed. One man was scratching himself vigorously under his tunic. Boren was already up and about, though he looked as if he hadn't slept at all. His massive frame moved with the same ponderous efficiency as he swept a pile of the worst debris towards the door with a worn besom broom. He didn't acknowledge your awakening, nor that of the others. His focus was purely on the task of readying his establishment for another day, or perhaps, just clearing enough space to begin it. The red-haired serving woman, her face pale in the dawn light and smudged with soot, was also present, listlessly wiping down the counter with the same perpetually damp rag. Her fiery spirit seemed dampened by the morning chill. There was no bustling breakfast service. The Black and Barrel wasn't that kind of establishment. What was offered, if anything, would be simple and utilitarian. You saw Boren ladle something from a pot that had been simmering slowly on a hook over the now cold hearth, perhaps a thin gruel, or yesterday's pottage reheated and diluted. A few of the awakening patrons shuffled towards him, coins already in hand. Your own stomach rumbled, a hollow, unhappy sound. The thought of more pottage was unappealing, but the gnawing emptiness needed to be addressed. And a drink, perhaps not ale, not yet, but something to wash the foul taste from your mouth. You wondered if they had small beer, the weaker, less intoxicating brew often consumed in the mornings. You felt a profound sense of weariness, not just physical, but a deeper, soul-level fatigue. The night in the Black and Barrel had been an immersion in the raw, unfiltered essence of a certain kind of life, hard, loud, often brutal, yet possessed of a strange, undeniable vitality. It was a world away from quiet contemplation or refined sensibilities. It was life lived at the sharp end, where pleasure was fleeting and often coarse, and where survival was a daily negotiation. As you sat there, amidst the lingering smells and the stirring bodies, watching the gray light slowly strengthen, you began to reflect on the significance of such a place. The Black and Barrel, and thousands like it scattered across the land, were more than just drinking dens. They were vital, messy, indispensable cogs in the machinery of medieval society. They were information hubs, where news from distant towns and pronouncements from lords and kings arrived, often garbled and embellished, but news nonetheless. Gossip, potent and pervasive, was traded as freely as ale, shaping reputations and fueling feuds. Deals were struck here, from the sale of a pig to the hiring of a mercenary. Travelers found shelter, however rough, and a momentary sense of connection in an unfamiliar land. For the local populace, the tavern was an escape valve, a place to forget the drudgery of their lives, the backbreaking labor, the constant threat of hunger and disease. It was a place to vent frustrations, to celebrate small victories, to feel, for a few hours, part of a community, however dysfunctional. Here, social strata, while not entirely erased, were certainly blurred. A knight out of armor, a prosperous merchant, and a humble peasant could find themselves sharing a bench, their differences temporarily submerged beneath the common denominator of thirst and the desire for company. It was a place of raw humanity, stripped of pretense. Joy, sorrow, anger, lust, greed, camaraderie, all were on open display, amplified by drink and proximity. It was a microcosm of the larger world, with all its beauty and its ugliness condensed into one smoky, raucous room. You pushed yourself to your feet, your joints creaking in protest. The air outside, even the undoubtedly fetid air of the lower quarter, would be a welcome change. You needed to clear your head, to shake off the lingering miasma of the tavern. As you made your way towards the oaken door, stepping carefully over a sleeping form, you glanced back. Boren was now serving a rough-looking man a ladleful of the steaming gruel into a wooden bowl. The red-haired woman was attempting to coax the embers in the hearth back to life. The cycle was beginning anew. The Black and Barrel was a harsh mistress, offering little comfort and even less refinement. But it was undeniably real. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, its capacity to find solace and society even in the grimmest of circumstances. It was a place you wouldn't soon forget, not the smells, nor the sounds, nor the faces in the flickering light. As you reached for the heavy door, the same door you had pushed open with such anticipation the previous evening, you felt a strange mix of relief and a peculiar, almost reluctant, nostalgia. You had passed through the oaken door, and for a night, you had lived within the heart of the medieval tavern. And you knew, with a certainty that settled deep in your bones, that you would carry a part of the blackened barrel with you, long after its specific memories faded. It had left its mark, like soot-staining timber, a gritty reminder of a world that was both brutal and profoundly, stubbornly, alive. Chapter 10, The Lingering Scent and the Open Road. The oaken door groaned its familiar complaint as you pushed it open, the sound now a familiar farewell rather than an unknown greeting. The air that hit you was a shock, not because it was fresh, the narrow alley still reeked of refuse, dampness, and the lingering effluvia of the night, but because it was different. It was thinner, colder, and carried a host of new, sharper smells that had been overwhelmed by the concentrated miasma within the blackened barrel. The tang of wood smoke from other awakening hearths, the distant, metallic scent of the smithy already at work, the damp earthiness of the unpaved lane, these distinct notes, previously masked, now asserted themselves. You stepped out, your boots sinking slightly into the mud, which seemed to have grown deeper and more treacherous overnight. The gray light of early morning was still weak, casting long, indistinct shadows. The street was quieter than the previous evening, but not silent. You could hear the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, a rhythmic counterpoint to the muffled snores still emanating from within the tavern. A shutter creaked open somewhere down the lane, followed by the querulous tones of an awakening resident. A lone dog, ribs starkly visible, nosed through a pile of refuse nearby, its tail giving a hopeful, tentative wag. You took a deep breath, filling your lungs with the chill morning air. It felt cleansing, despite its urban impurities, washing away some of the stale fug of the tavern. Your head still throbbed, a dull reminder of Boren's potent ale, and your body ached with the memory of the hard bench. But there was also a sense of release, of having emerged from a deep, dark, and strangely compelling burrow. Looking back at the blackened barrel, it seemed even more squat and dilapidated in the revealing light of day. The thatched roof sagged alarmingly in places, and the timber frame looked ancient and weary. The oaken door, now closed, was just a piece of wood again, albeit one rich with the patina of countless entries and exits. There was no sign of life from within, save for a thin tendril of smoke that had just begun to curl from its chimney, a testament to the red-haired woman's efforts with the embers. It looked like a sleeping beast, digesting the remnants of the night's revelry. You began to walk, your steps slow and deliberate at first, your body gradually reacquainting itself with movement. The narrow lane, which had seemed so menacing and confusing the previous evening, now felt more familiar, its twists and turns less daunting in the light of day. You passed the butcher's shack, now shuttered and silent, the hanging carcasses presumably taken down or covered for the night. The eel's woman was not yet at her post. The town was slowly, reluctantly, waking up. As you walked, the experience of the blackened barrel replayed itself in your mind, not as a series of distinct events, but as a collage of sensory impressions. The overwhelming warmth and noise upon entry. The flickering, insufficient light painting grotesque shadows. The complex bouquet of smoke, stale ale, sweat, and unidentifiable food. The feel of the rough, sticky tables and the hard, unforgiving benches. The taste of the cloudy ale and the hearty, if crude, pottage. The gallery of faces, Boren's granite visage. The red-haired woman's weary competence, the drunken revelers, the quiet gamblers, the mournful bard. The sudden, chaotic eruption of the brawl and Boren's swift, decisive restoration of his particular brand of order. The slow descent into the late-night quiet, the shared vulnerability of strangers seeking shelter. It was, you reflected, a harsh environment. There was little beauty in the blackened barrel, little comfort, and certainly no refinement. It was a place of basic needs, crudely met. Yet, it possessed a powerful, undeniable magnetism. It was a crucible, forging temporary bonds of community out of shared hardship and the universal desire for escape or oblivion. It was a stage upon which the daily dramas of ordinary lives were played out with unvarnished honesty. What lingered most profoundly, perhaps even more than the visual memories, were the smells. Even now, walking in the open air, you could almost catch a phantom whiff of that unique tavern aroma, the wood smoke, the spilled ale, the damp wool, the human musk. It was a scent that would likely cling to your clothes for days, a subtle reminder of where you had been. It was the perfume of the common medieval experience, potent and unforgettable. The tavern, you realized, served a purpose far beyond the merely commercial. It was a social necessity. In a world of rigid hierarchies and often isolating labor, it was one of the few places where different strata could, to some extent, mingle. It was a clearinghouse for information, a marketplace for services both licit and illicit, a forum for debate, and a repository of local lore and legend. It was where loneliness could be assuaged, however temporarily, and where the grim realities of life could be softened, if only for a few hours, by the camaraderie of the cup. Your thoughts turned to the people. Boren, the stoic guardian of his chaotic realm. The serving women, navigating their perilous path with resilience and sharp wit. The countless patrons, each with their own story, their own reasons for seeking out the smoky embrace of the tavern. They were not heroes or villains, just ordinary folk, wrestling with the everyday challenges of their existence, seeking a moment's respite or a spark of connection in a world that often offered little of either. By the time you reached the edge of the lower quarter, where the lanes began to widen slightly and the buildings showed signs of greater prosperity, the sun had climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist. The town was fully awake now, the sounds of commerce and daily life replacing the nocturnal quiet. Carts rumbled over uneven cobblestones, merchants hawked their wares, and the smells of baking bread and roasting meat from more reputable establishments began to fill the air. The Blackened Barrel already felt like a world away, a half-remembered dream from a different reality. Yet, the experience had left an indelible imprint. It had offered a deep dive, not just into a physical space, but into a state of being, a glimpse into the unfiltered heart of medieval sociability. It was a reminder that history is not just about kings and battles, but about the everyday lives of ordinary people, their struggles, their joys, and the places where they sought to find meaning and connection. You paused at a junction, considering your next direction. The road ahead was open. Whether you sought another town, another adventure, or simply the continuation of your journey, the memory of the Blackened Barrel would travel with you. It was a chapter in your own story, a vivid, sensory encounter that had enriched your understanding of the world and its inhabitants. The oaken door had led you into a place of shadows and clamor, of rough comfort and raw humanity. And as you walked away, you carried not just the lingering scent of its unique atmosphere, but a deeper appreciation for the complex, often contradictory, and utterly vital role of the medieval tavern in the tapestry of life. It was, in its own rough-hewn way, a cornerstone of its society, a place where the pulse of the common people beat strongest. And you had felt that pulse, deep within its smoky, boisterous heart. Underscore 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 underscore. Self-correction. I will continue to build on the narrative, focusing now on broader reflections and perhaps a final look back, or a sense of what the character takes away permanently from this experience. The prompt asks for significant length, so there's room to expand on these concluding thoughts and the lingering impact. Chapter 11, Echoes in the Cobblestones. The sun climbed higher, and the immediate, visceral sensations of the Blackened Barrel began to recede, replaced by a more contemplative mood. The dull ache in your head had subsided to a faint thrumming, and the stiffness in your limbs was easing with movement. Yet, the tavern lingered, not as an oppressive presence, but as a series of echoes, resonating with each step you took away from the lower quarter. The cobblestones beneath your boots, cleaner and more evenly laid in this more prosperous part of town, felt different from the yielding, muck-and-straw floor of the tavern. Each firm impact was a reminder of the solid, often unforgiving, reality of the world outside Boren's domain. The sounds of the bustling marketplace, the clear calls of vendors, the chatter of shoppers, the clatter of goods, were a stark contrast to the muffled, introspective hum of the late-night tavern or the chaotic roar of its peak hours. Here, interactions were more overtly transactional, focused on goods and coin, less on the blurred lines of shared experience and inebriation. Yet, even here, in the brighter, more orderly streets, you found yourself looking at people differently. You saw a group of laborers repairing a section of wall, their movements weary, their faces smudged with dirt, and you wondered if they, too, would seek solace in a place like the Blackened Barrel come evening. You saw a merchant arguing heatedly over the price of cloth, and you recalled the hushed, conspiratorial tones of the traders in the tavern's dim corners. Every encounter, every observed interaction, seemed to hold a faint reflection of the dynamics you had witnessed within those smoky walls. The tavern experience, you realized, had sharpened your senses, made you more attuned to the subtle currents of human behavior, the unspoken languages of posture, glance, and tone. It had been an education in a raw, unlettered kind of sociology. You had seen desperation and joy, cunning and foolishness, cruelty and surprising kindness, all existing side by side, often within the same individual, amplified and laid bare by the tavern's unique environment. You found yourself considering the concept of community. The bonds forged in the Blackened Barrel were transient, often fueled by ale and circumstance. Yet, for those hours spent sharing a bench, a song, or a grievance, there was a palpable sense of belonging, however fleeting. It was a community of outsiders, of the overlooked, of those who found themselves on the fringes of more respectable society. And in that shared marginalization, there was a strange kind of strength, a defiant assertion of existence. The women of the tavern, in particular, stayed in your mind. The red-haired serving woman, with her weary resilience and sharp tongue, embodied a particular kind of strength, navigating a world fraught with casual menace and constant demands. Her life, you imagined, was one of relentless hard work, of enduring lewd remarks and grasping hands, all for a few meager pennies. Yet, she moved through it with a certain unyielding spirit. The other women, too, the traders, the courtesans, each carved out their existence in a world that offered them few easy paths. The tavern was both a stage for their struggles and a source of their livelihood. You thought of the bard, his out-of-tune lute and mournful songs. He was, in his own way, a chronicler, a keeper of stories, however embellished or poorly rendered. In a world where literacy was rare, oral tradition was paramount, and men like him, however untalented, played a role in disseminating tales, news, and cultural memory. His ignored persistence was a quiet testament to the human need for narrative, for art, even in its crudest forms. The food and drink, too, held a deeper significance than mere sustenance. The cloudy ale, the humble pottage, these were not just calories, but symbols. They represented a shared experience, a common denominator that transcended individual fortunes. To partake in them was to participate in a ritual, a communion of sorts, that bound the patrons together. The act of sharing a loaf of coarse bread, of passing a skin of cheap wine, created connections, however temporary. Even the brawls, like the one between Finn and Jorn, had their place. They were a release of pent-up aggression, a crude form of justice or entertainment, a way of settling scores or asserting dominance in a world where formal recourse was often unavailable or too slow. Boren's swift, pragmatic intervention underscored the tavern's role as a self-regulating entity, operating by its own unwritten laws and customs. As you walked, you realized that the Blackened Barrel was not an anomaly, but a type. Every town, every village, would have its equivalent, perhaps cleaner or rougher, larger or smaller, but serving the same essential functions. These were the unofficial town halls, the people's forums, the places where the pulse of common life could be most keenly felt. They were the underbelly, perhaps, but also the foundation upon which more civilized structures rested. They absorbed the discontent, the loneliness, the sheer weariness of a population often living on the edge. The deep dive you had sought was not just into a building, but into a mindset, a way of life. It was an exploration of the medieval idea, raw and unfiltered. And what you were taking away was not just a collection of vivid memories, but a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of that era. It was easy to romanticize the past, to focus on knights and castles, or to condemn it wholesale for its brutality and ignorance. The reality, as experienced in the smoky depths of the Blackened Barrel, was far more complicated, a messy, vibrant, and intensely human tapestry of light and shadow. The sun was now high enough to cast shorter shadows. The marketplace was in full swing. Your stomach rumbled again, this time with a more genuine hunger, not just the need to fill a void. You spotted a baker's stall, the aroma of freshly baked bread, a scent far more refined than that of the tavern's stale loaves, wafting invitingly. Perhaps, you thought, it was time for a different kind of meal, in a different kind of place. But the echoes of the Blackened Barrel, the shouts, the songs, the clinking mugs, the sheer, overwhelming presence of unvarnished humanity, would not be easily silenced. They had become part of the soundtrack of your journey, a bass note thrumming beneath the melody of your own experiences. The oaken door had closed behind you, but the experience it contained had, in a way, opened something new within you. Chapter 12, The Weight of Coin and the Worth of a Tale. You approached the baker's stall, the warm, yeasty aroma a welcome contrast to the lingering phantom smells of the tavern. Here, the transaction was simple, clean. You pointed to a small, well-browned loaf, handed over a coin, and received your purchase with a polite nod. There was no need for shouting, no jostling, no undercurrent of potential conflict. It was an exchange of a different order, governed by the straightforward rules of commerce in the daylight world. As you broke off a piece of the bread, its crust crisp, its crumbs soft and flavorful, you considered the coin you had spent. Pennies, a few coppers. The same currency that had bought you ale, pottage, and a precarious night's shelter in the Blackened Barrel. The same currency that had fueled the arguments, paid for the fleeting pleasures, and perhaps, in some small way, kept Boren's grim enterprise afloat. The weight of coin in a place like the tavern was immense. It was the lubricant of all interactions, the measure of a man's immediate worth, the key to a momentary easing of life's burdens. For the price of a few drinks, a man could buy forgetfulness, camaraderie, warmth. For a few more, perhaps a fleeting moment of intimacy or a marginally more comfortable place to sleep. Debt, you knew, was a constant shadow in such establishments, leading to whispered threats, sudden confrontations, and occasionally, the heavy hand of the tavern keeper. Boren's mental ledger of who owed what was likely as formidable as his physical presence. You had paid your way, asked for little, observed much. You were a traveler, passing through, your coins fresh from other towns, other transactions. But for the regulars, for those whose lives were inextricably bound to the rhythm of the Blackened Barrel, the daily struggle for those few essential pennies was a harsh reality. It dictated their choices, limited their horizons, and often, drove them back through that oaken door night after night. The experience itself, your deep dive, was now becoming a tale in your own mind. A story you might recount, perhaps embellished, perhaps edited for more sensitive ears, in other taverns, in other towns. The worth of a good tale, you knew, could sometimes be as valuable as coin. It could buy you a drink, a meal, a moment of attention, even a measure of respect. The bard in the Blackened Barrel, for all his lack of skill, understood this fundamental truth. His songs, however poorly executed, were an attempt to trade narrative for sustenance. And what was the narrative of the Blackened Barrel? It was a story of resilience, certainly. Of people finding ways to endure, to snatch moments of joy or oblivion from the relentless grind of their existence. It was a story of community, however flawed and fractured. It was a story of the unvarnished human condition, stripped bare of polite societal fictions. You thought about the details you would choose to include if you were to tell this tale. The oppressive smoke, the cacophony of sound, the gallery of unforgettable faces. Boren, a silent, immovable mountain of a man. The red-haired serving woman, a spark of defiance in the gloom. The brawl, a sudden explosion of drunken fury, quickly contained. The quiet desperation of the late-night hours. The sheer, unadulterated life of the place, in all its messy, contradictory glory. Would others understand? Would they grasp the peculiar charm that lay hidden beneath the grime and the noise? Or would they simply hear a story of squalor and drunkenness? Perhaps it depended on the listener, on their own experiences, their own capacity for empathy. The value of the experience, for you, was not in its comfort or its beauty, but in its authenticity. The Blackened Barrel had offered no illusions. It was what it was, unapologetically. And in a world often shrouded in pretense and hypocrisy, there was a certain stark honesty to that. It had been a lesson in seeing things as they are, not as one might wish them to be. You continued your walk, the bread in your hand a simple, wholesome pleasure. The town was now fully alive around you, a complex organism of trade, labor, and social interaction. You passed a church, its stone walls solid and imposing, the sound of distant chanting filtering out, a different kind of sanctuary, offering a different kind of solace. You saw children playing a boisterous game in a dusty square, their laughter innocent and carefree, a world away from the adult anxieties that permeated the tavern. Each of these scenes, these snippets of daily life, now carried a slightly different resonance, viewed through the lens of your night in the Blackened Barrel. You understood, perhaps a little more deeply, the pressures and the needs that drove people to seek out such places. It wasn't just about thirst or hunger. It was about a deeper human craving, for connection, for escape, for a momentary sense of belonging in a vast and often indifferent world. The road out of town beckoned. Your journey was far from over. There would be other towns, other taverns, other experiences. But the Blackened Barrel would remain a benchmark, a reference point. It had provided not just a night's lodging, however rough, but an insight. A glimpse behind the curtain of medieval life, into a space where the raw, untamed heart of its people beat loud and strong. The coins you had spent there were gone, absorbed into Boren's coffers, perhaps already redistributed into the local economy. But what you had gained in return, the memories, the understanding, the story, that was yours to keep. And in its own way, it was a form of wealth far more lasting than the pennies that had purchased it. The weight of that experience, the worth of the tale it had become, would travel with you, enriching your perspective and shaping your understanding of the human drama, wherever your road might lead. The sun was warm on your face now, a welcome change from the chill of the tavern's dawn. You squared your shoulders, took another bite of bread, and set your sights on the horizon. The oaken door was behind you, but the echoes of what lay within it would resonate for a long time to come. Chapter 13, The Shifting Sands of Memory and the Distillation of Truth. Days turned into weeks, and the sharp, immediate details of your night in the Blackened Barrel began to soften, like watercolors blurred by rain. The oppressive reek of stale ale and smoke became a fainter, more generalized memory of pungency. The exact configuration of faces in the flickering candlelight grew less distinct, merging into a composite image of weary, wary humanity. The specific shouts and songs faded into a general recollection of overwhelming noise. This was the natural process of memory, sanding down the rough edges, leaving behind a smoother, more generalized impression. Yet, paradoxically, as some details faded, others seemed to gain in significance. The core emotional truths of the place, the underlying currents of human experience you had witnessed, became clearer, distilled from the raw sensory data. It was no longer just about the grime on the floor or the taste of the ale, it was about what those things represented. You found yourself reflecting on the idea of truth itself as it related to the Blackened Barrel. Was the truth in the squalor, the violence, the desperation? Or was it in the moments of laughter, the shared songs, the fleeting connections between strangers? Perhaps, you concluded, the truth lay in the uncomfortable coexistence of all these things. The tavern was a microcosm of life's inherent contradictions, ugliness and beauty, cruelty and kindness, despair and hope, all swirling together in a potent, often confusing, brew. The story of the Blackened Barrel, as you began to recount it to fellow travelers in other, sometimes cleaner, sometimes rougher, establishments, also began to shift and evolve. You found yourself emphasizing different aspects depending on your audience, or perhaps on your own mood. Sometimes, you would focus on the humor, the absurdity of the drunken arguments, the bard's comically bad playing, the sheer, chaotic energy of the place. Other times, you might dwell on the pathos, the the quiet desperation in some of the patrons' eyes, the harshness of their lives, the fleeting nature of their pleasures. You noticed that certain details resonated more strongly with listeners. The image of Boren, the silent, unmovable keeper, often drew nods of recognition. Every tavern, it seemed, had its equivalent, its figure of stoic authority. The mention of the brawl, with its clumsy fury and swift resolution, usually elicited a chuckle or a knowing story in return. The description of the shared, flea-ridden lodging often brought groans of sympathetic understanding from those who had endured similar discomforts. Through these retellings, the experience became less a purely personal memory and more a shared archetype. The Blackened Barrel ceased to be just one specific, leaning building in one particular grimy alley, and transformed into a representation of all such places, a symbol of the medieval tavern experience itself. And in that transformation, perhaps, lay a deeper truth. You also began to understand more keenly the role of such places as societal safety valves. The frustrations and aggressions that might otherwise spill out into more destructive forms of social unrest were, to some extent, contained and dissipated within the tavern's walls. The arguments, the brawls, even the sheer volume of drunken noise, could be seen as a kind of necessary catharsis, a way for a marginalized populace to vent its steam without threatening the broader social order. The authorities, you suspected, likely tolerated, even tacitly encouraged, the existence of such establishments for this very reason, as long as they didn't become too disorderly. The memory of the food and drink, too, evolved. While initially it had been about satisfying immediate, physical needs, it now took on a symbolic weight. The coarse bread and simple pottage became emblematic of a life lived close to the bone, a world without luxuries, where sustenance itself was a daily struggle and a cause for gratitude. The strong, unfiltered ale represented a brief escape, a temporary dulling of hardship, a liquid courage to face another day. These were not the refined pleasures of the wealthy, but the robust, earthy consolations of the common folk. You found that the experience had subtly altered your own perceptions of comfort and hardship. A clean straw pallet in a quiet inn now felt like a king's featherbed by comparison. A simple meal of fresh bread and cheese, eaten in peace, seemed a banquet. The night in the Blackened Barrel had recalibrated your internal measure of such things, fostering a deeper appreciation for small comforts and a more profound understanding of what it meant to truly endure. The people you had encountered there, though their faces might blur, remained as powerful archetypes. The stoic keeper, the resilient serving woman, the boastful soldier, the mournful peasant, the hopeful bard, the desperate gambler, they were not just individuals, but representations of the myriad roles and struggles within their society. They were the faces of an age, etched not in stone or parchment, but in the living memory of places like the Blackened Barrel. And so, the deep dive continued, not in the physical space of the tavern, but in the shifting sands of your memory and understanding. The initial, overwhelming flood of sensations was slowly being processed, filtered, and distilled into a more potent, more meaningful essence. The truth of the Blackened Barrel was not a single, static thing, but a living, evolving understanding, one that would continue to shape your perception of the world long after the last phantom scent of stale ale had faded from your clothes. It was an experience that had burrowed deep, not just into your memory, but into the very fabric of your awareness. Chapter 14, The Unseen Threads and the Fabric of Society. The further you traveled from the Blackened Barrel, both in distance and in time, the more you began to perceive the unseen threads that connected such an establishment to the broader fabric of medieval society. It was not an isolated carbuncle on the face of the town, as some more refined folk might dismiss it, but an integral, if often unacknowledged, part of its ecosystem. Consider the sources of its supplies. The ale Boren served didn't materialize from thin air. It came from local brewers, small-scale operations perhaps, or even from monastic breweries that sold their surplus. The grain for that ale was grown by peasants in the surrounding countryside, harvested with sweat and toil, and transported to the town by carters who themselves might frequent the tavern for a fortifying drink. The wood that fueled the hearth was cut by woodcutters, hauled from forests that were often jealously guarded by local lords. The meat in the pottage, however humble, came from butchers, who in turn relied on farmers and drovers. Even the straw on the floor, constantly needing replenishment, represented a link to the agricultural cycle. The Blackened Barrel, for all its grime, was a node in a complex network of production and exchange. The money that circulated within its walls, those hard-won pennies and coppers, didn't simply vanish into Boren's coffers. He, in turn, had to pay for his supplies, perhaps pay rent or taxes to a landlord or the town authorities. That money would then flow outwards, supporting other trades, other families. The tavern, therefore, played a role, however modest, in the local economy, a place where coin changed hands frequently, stimulating a microcirculation of wealth. Think, too, of the information that flowed through it. News of distant wars, royal decrees, market prices in other towns, warnings of plague or bandits, all these snippets, carried by travelers, merchants, and wandering minstrels, would be shared, debated, and disseminated within the tavern's walls long before they reached more formal channels, if such channels even existed for the common folk. It was a living newspaper, a rumor mill, and a vital conduit for the kind of practical knowledge needed to navigate a precarious world. A farmer might learn of a new blight affecting crops in a neighboring region, a craftsman might hear of demand for his skills in another town. The tavern also served as an informal labor exchange. A lord steward looking for temporary hands for the harvest, a master mason seeking laborers for a new construction project, a merchant needing guards for a perilous journey, all might discreetly put out feelers in the tavern, knowing they would find a pool of men eager for work, however temporary or dangerous. You had seen a few such hushed conversations, men leaning in close, assessing each other, a quick agreement sealed with a shared drink. And what of justice, or its absence? While Boren maintained his own rough order, the tavern was also a place where grievances were aired, disputes sometimes settled, or escalated, and public opinion formed. A man known for cheating at dice or welshing on debts would find his reputation preceding him, his welcome cooler. The collective judgment of the tavern regulars, while not legally binding, could be a powerful social force. It was a court of public opinion, operating by its own unwritten codes. Even the less savory aspects, the gambling, the occasional violence, the presence of courtesans, filled a certain societal niche, however uncomfortable. These were outlets for impulses that, if entirely suppressed, might find more disruptive expression elsewhere. The tavern acted as a container, a designated space for activities that were frowned upon, but perhaps tacitly acknowledged as inevitable parts of the human condition. The Blackened Barrel, then, was not just a place for individuals to seek solace, it was a functional component of the town itself. It absorbed some of its tensions, facilitated some of its commerce, spread its news, and provided a space for a significant portion of its population to simply be. It was connected by 1,000 unseen threads to the fields, the workshops, the markets, even the manor houses and monasteries that might, on the surface, seem a world away. This realization added another layer to your reflections. The experience was not just about the sensory immersion, or the individual stories, but about understanding the intricate, often messy, interconnectedness of medieval life. The tavern was a lens through which you could see the workings of a whole society, its strengths and weaknesses, its declared values and its unacknowledged realities. The memory of the oaken door now represented more than just an entrance to a building. It was a portal into this complex, interwoven world. Passing through it, you had not just entered a drinking den, you had stepped into a microcosm of an entire age, with all its vitality, its struggles, and its surprising resilience. The threads that bound the Blackened Barrel to its surroundings were largely invisible to a casual observer, but having spent a night within its embrace, you now saw them everywhere, subtly shaping the landscape of the medieval world. It was a reminder that even the lowliest, roughest parts of society played their role in the greater whole, like the dark, gnarled roots that anchor a mighty tree. Chapter 15, The Scars and Strengths Forged in Smoke. The more you contemplated the world revealed through the oaken door of the Blackened Barrel, the more you recognized the profound impact such an environment must have had on the character of the people who frequented it. It was not a place that coddled or refined, it was a crucible, forging both scars and peculiar strengths in those who sought its smoky embrace. Consider the sheer resilience required to navigate such a space regularly. The ability to endure physical discomfort, the hard benches, the cold draughts, the often foul air, was a given. But more than that, it demanded a mental toughness. To hold one's own in loud, often aggressive, company, to ignore casual insults or provocations, or to know precisely when not to ignore them, to be constantly aware of one's surroundings, vigilant against pickpockets or sudden flare-ups of violence, these were skills honed in the tavern's challenging school. The constant exposure to a wide spectrum of humanity, from the mournful drunk to the cunning cheat, from the boastful soldier to the desperate laborer, must have fostered a sharp, if cynical, understanding of human nature. Illusions about the inherent goodness or nobility of man would likely not survive long in the blackened barrel. Instead, one would develop a pragmatic awareness of motivations, a quick eye for deceit, and a healthy skepticism towards grand pronouncements or easy promises. This was not necessarily a negative trait, in a world full of perils and uncertainties. Such astuteness was a valuable survival tool. The art of communication, too, was shaped by the tavern environment. Polite euphemisms and subtle hints had little place amidst the din. Speech was often direct, blunt, and laced with a rich vocabulary of curses and colloquialisms. To make oneself heard, literally and figuratively, required a certain forcefulness, a willingness to assert one's presence. Yet, paradoxically, the tavern could also teach the value of discretion, of knowing when to speak and when to hold one's tongue, when to share information and when to keep it close. The hushed conversations in shadowed corners were as much a part of the tavern's linguistic landscape as the shouted arguments. Loyalty and betrayal, friendship and enmity, these primal social dynamics were played out in stark relief. Friendships forged over shared flagons of ale might be fiercely defended, at least for the evening. Grudges, nursed in drunken silence, could erupt with sudden violence. The tavern was a place where social bonds were constantly tested, broken, and reformed. It taught a harsh lesson in the fickleness of human allegiances, but also, perhaps, the enduring power of genuine camaraderie when it could be found amidst the chaos. The constant proximity to hardship, your own and that of others, could lead to a certain hardening of the heart, a necessary emotional callousing. To be overly sensitive in the blackened barrel was to invite misery. Yet, you had also witnessed moments of rough kindness, a shared crust of bread, a comforting arm thrown around a weeping companion, a coin pressed into the hand of the hapless bard. These small acts of compassion, shining all the brighter against the dark backdrop of general indifference, suggested that even in the harshest environments, the human capacity for empathy could not be entirely extinguished. Think of Boren. His stoicism, his unyielding demeanor, his swift and unsentimental justice, these were not the traits of a cruel man, necessarily, but of one who had learned, through long and bitter experience, what was required to survive and maintain order in his particular domain. His scars were likely internal, etched by countless nights of witnessing human folly and desperation. His strength was in his unwavering pragmatism, his ability to absorb the endless waves of chaos and remain standing, like a weathered rock against a stormy sea. The serving women, too, displayed a remarkable blend of toughness and tenacity. They navigated a minefield of potential harassment and abuse with a combination of sharp wit, weary tolerance, and an unyielding refusal to be broken. Their resilience was a quiet heroism, often overlooked but essential to the functioning of the tavern. They saw humanity at its worst, yet they returned each day, ready to face it anew. Even the patrons, in their own ways, exhibited strengths forged in the tavern's fire. The ability to find joy in simple pleasures, to laugh in the face of adversity, to form temporary communities in a world that often sought to isolate, these were not insignificant achievements. The songs, however off-key, were an act of defiance against silence and despair. The shared drinks were a toast to survival, a momentary affirmation of life in all its messy, unpredictable glory. The Blackened Barrel, therefore, was more than just a place to get drunk. It was a shaper of character, a harsh teacher, a relentless tester of mettle. It stripped away pretense, exposed vulnerabilities, and demanded a certain raw, unvarnished strength from those who wished to endure within its walls. The scars it inflicted were undeniable, but so too were the peculiar, often unacknowledged, strengths it fostered, resilience, astuteness, a pragmatic understanding of the world, and a stubborn refusal to be entirely defeated by its hardships. These were the indelible marks left by the tavern, not just on the bodies, but on the very souls of those who passed through its oaken door. Chapter 16, The Tavern's Reflection in the Wider World. Leaving the blackened barrel and re-entering the broader flow of medieval life, you began to see its reflection, its echoes, in unexpected places. The raw, unvarnished dynamics you had witnessed within its smoky confines were not unique to that specific establishment. Rather, the tavern seemed to concentrate and amplify tendencies that were present, albeit often more subtly, throughout society. Consider the marketplace, bustling with commerce. The haggling over prices, the sharp-eyed assessment of goods and customers, the occasional dispute over quality or payment, these were more formalized, perhaps less alcohol-fueled, versions of the transactions and confrontations you'd seen in the tavern. The merchant carefully weighing his words, the customer feigning indifference to secure a better deal, these were echoes of the guarded conversations and strategic silences around the tavern's gambling tables. The desire to get the better of a bargain, the suspicion of being cheated, these fundamental human impulses were at play in both settings. Think of the Lord's Court, or even the village moot. Here, justice was supposedly dispensed, grievances heard, and decisions made that affected the lives of many. Yet, beneath the veneer of formal procedure, were there not echoes of the tavern's rough-and-tumble social order? Factions formed, alliances shifted, reputations were made and broken by whispers and accusations. The powerful man who could command attention with a booming voice or a threatening glare in the tavern might find similar tactics effective, if more politely disguised, in these more respectable forums. The need to navigate complex social hierarchies, to understand who held influence and how to gain their favor, was as crucial in the court as it was in Boren's domain. Even in the sanctuary of the church, where piety and devotion were ostensibly paramount, you could not entirely escape the shadows of the tavern. The fleshy friar you'd seen enjoying his ale with gusto was a reminder that the sacred and the profane were often uncomfortably intertwined. The competition for alms, the jockeying for position within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the whispers of scandal or heresy, these, too, had their parallels in the more worldly struggles for resources and status you'd witnessed over sticky wooden tables. The human desire for solace, for meaning, for a sense of belonging, drove people both to the altar and to the ale bench, albeit seeking different forms of communion. The roads themselves, those arteries of medieval life, teemed with travelers who carried the tavern's spirit with them. The camaraderie of a shared journey, the swapping of tales around a campfire, the cautious assessment of fellow wayfarers, these were extensions of the social dynamics fostered in places like the Blackened Barrel. The need for vigilance against bandits, the reliance on rumor and local knowledge to navigate safely, the search for shelter and sustenance at the end of a long day, these were the realities of the road, mirrored in the microcosm of the tavern. The songs and stories, too, that had filled the tavern's smoky air, found their echoes in the wider world. The minstrel performing in a castle hall, the storyteller captivating a village audience, even the mother lulling her child to sleep with an ancient ballad, all were part of the same rich oral tradition that thrived in the tavern. These narratives, whether heroic, tragic, or comic, served to bind communities, transmit values, and make sense of a complex and often frightening world. The tavern was simply one of the most fertile grounds for their cultivation and dissemination. What this suggested was that the Blackened Barrel was not an aberration, a separate, deviant space, but rather a concentrated expression of its time. It held up a distorted, perhaps, but nonetheless revealing, mirror to the society that surrounded it. The same human passions, ambitions, fears, and desires that drove kings and bishops also animated the humble patrons of the tavern. The difference lay mainly in the scale of their expression and the resources at their command. The roughness, the occasional brutality, the pervasive struggle for survival that characterized the tavern were not confined to its walls. They were endemic to the medieval world, a world of precarious harvests. Endemic disease, frequent warfare, and a justice system that was often arbitrary or inaccessible to the common person. The tavern, in this context, was less a cause of societal ills and more a symptom, a place where the pressures of that world were most visibly and audibly manifest. This understanding brought a certain melancholy. The oaken door had led you not just to a place of fleeting escape for its patrons, but to a deeper understanding of the pervasive hardships they sought to escape from. The laughter in the blackened barrel was often the laughter of men and women who had little else. The camaraderie was the bond of those who faced a harsh world together. The ale was a temporary balm for wounds that ran deep. Yet, there was also a profound admiration for the resilience it revealed. The ability of people to find joy, to create community, to tell stories, to simply endure, in the face of such challenges, was a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. The blackened barrel, in its own rough way, celebrated that spirit, night after night. It was a monument, not of stone and mortar, but of shared experience and stubborn survival, reflecting the enduring, messy, and often contradictory heart of the medieval world itself. And its echoes, you now realized, were everywhere, if one only knew how to listen. Chapter 17, The Traveler's Pack and the Weight of Witness. As you continued your journey, the physical pack on your back, containing your few worldly possessions, a spare tunic, perhaps a memento from a previous stop, felt no heavier than before. But you carried another, less tangible burden, or perhaps, a treasure, the weight of witness from your time in the blackened barrel. It was the accumulation of sights, sounds, smells, and emotions that had settled within you, demanding to be processed, to be understood, to be, in some way, honored. This weight of witness was not a sorrowful burden, though it contained elements of melancholy. It was more a sense of responsibility, a feeling that having been granted such an intimate glimpse into a hidden corner of life, you now bore a duty to remember it, not just as a collection of anecdotes, but as a testament to the lives lived within those smoky walls. These were people largely unrecorded by the grand chroniclers of the age, their stories untold in the official histories. Their joys and sorrows, their struggles and small triumphs, would mostly fade into oblivion, like the smoke from Bourne's chimney. Yet, for a brief time, you had been privy to them. This feeling subtly altered your interactions with the world. When you saw a peasant toiling in a field, you no longer saw just a laborer, you saw a potential patron of a future tavern, seeking respite from that very toil, his face perhaps mirroring some of the weary visages you recalled from the blackened barrel. When you heard a minstrel in a marketplace, you listened with a new appreciation for the tradition he upheld, remembering the hopeful, if untalented, bard in the corner. When you encountered gruffness or suspicion from a stranger, you were perhaps a little quicker to understand the harsh experiences that might have forged such a demeanor, recalling the constant vigilance required in Bourne's establishment. The experience had given you a kind of internal compass, a way of navigating the complexities of human behavior with a little more insight, a little more empathy. It wasn't that you had become naive, if anything, the blackened barrel had reinforced a healthy skepticism. But it had also revealed the shared humanity that lay beneath even the roughest exteriors. You found yourself more observant of the small details of daily life, the unspoken cues, the subtle power dynamics at play in everyday interactions. The tavern had been a compressed, intensified version of these things, and having studied them there, you were now more adept at recognizing them in the wider world. It was like learning a new language. Once you understood the grammar and vocabulary, you began to hear it spoken everywhere. The desire to tell the story of the blackened barrel, which had initially been a way to entertain or perhaps to process your own experience, now felt like something more. It was a way of giving voice to the voiceless, of preserving a sliver of their reality. Each retelling was an act of witness, a way of saying, these people existed. Their lives mattered. This is what I saw. Of course, you were aware of the limitations of your perspective. You were an outsider, a transient observer. You had not lived their lives, shared their daily struggles year in and year out. Your deep dive was just that, a dive, not a permanent immersion. Yet, even a brief glimpse through that oaken door had been profoundly illuminating. The weight of witness also brought with it a certain humility. The grand narratives of history often focus on the powerful, the victorious, the literate. But the true fabric of any age is woven from the countless unrecorded lives of ordinary people. The blackened barrel had reminded you of this fundamental truth. It had shown you that history was not just happening in castles and battlefields, but in the dim, smoky confines of countless taverns, in the conversations, the arguments, the shared songs, and the quiet endurance of those who sought refuge within them. This understanding didn't make your own journey seem less important, but it placed it within a broader, richer context. You were one traveler among many, one storyteller among countless others, each carrying their own pack of experiences, their own weight of witness. And the world was a vast, complex tapestry, woven from all these individual threads. The memories of the blackened barrel, the good, the bad, the ugly, had become an integral part of your own internal landscape. They were a source of reflection, a wellspring of stories, and a constant reminder of the raw, resilient, and often overlooked heart of the medieval world. This was the true treasure you carried away from that oaken door, far more valuable than any coin, more lasting than any physical memento. It was the indelible mark of having truly seen, and in seeing, having begun to understand. And that, you realized, was a profound gift, one that would continue to shape your path, long after the specific tavern and its patrons had faded into the mists of time. Chapter 18, The Enduring Power of Place and the Unwritten Chronicles. As the seasons turned and your travels led you further afield, through landscapes that bore little resemblance to the cramped, muddy alleys surrounding the blackened barrel, the tavern itself began to take on an almost mythical quality in your mind. It was no longer just a specific location, but an archetype, a potent symbol of a certain kind of human experience. And with this symbolic weight came a deeper appreciation for the enduring power of place, how certain locations can absorb and radiate the essence of the lives lived within them. The blackened barrel was, in its own humble way, a sacred space. Not sacred in the religious sense, of course, but sacred to the needs it served, to the raw humanity it sheltered. Like an ancient tree that has witnessed generations pass beneath its boughs, the tavern's timbers were imbued with the stories, the emotions, the very breath of those who had sought refuge there. The layers of grime, the worn smooth wood, the perpetual scent of smoke and spillage, these were not just signs of neglect, but a physical accumulation of history, an unwritten chronicle of countless anonymous lives. You began to wonder about the tavern's own lifespan. How long had it stood there, leaning precariously against its neighbor? Who had first laid its foundation stones, first raised its oaken door? Had it always been a tavern, or had it served other purposes in a forgotten past? These were questions with no easy answers, lost to the unrecorded annals of the common folk. But the very act of wondering about them deepened your sense of connection to the place, and to the countless others like it that formed the unseen infrastructure of medieval life. This led to a broader reflection on the nature of history itself. The grand chronicles, penned by monks or court scribes, focused on the deeds of kings, the doctrines of the church, the outcomes of battles. They painted a picture of the past, certainly, but it was often a selective, top-down view. The history of the blackened barrel, and of the people who frequented it, was largely unwritten, or written only in the ephemeral languages of oral tradition, folk song, and shared memory. Yet, this unwritten history was no less vital, no less true. It was the history of daily struggles, of small joys and profound sorrows, of the relentless effort to survive and find meaning in a harsh world. It was the history of the vast majority of people, whose lives formed the bedrock upon which the more visible structures of power and prestige were built. The tavern, in its own way, was an archive of this unwritten history. Every carved initial on a tabletop, every stain on the floor, every ghost of a song lingering in the smoky air, was a fragment of this forgotten chronicle. Boren, though he would never have thought of himself as such, was its unwitting curator, his very presence a testament to its continuity. The serving women were its living scribes, their daily interactions adding new lines to its endless narrative. This realization imbued your memories of the blackened barrel with a new sense of urgency. The experience was not just a personal anecdote, it was a connection to this vast, submerged history. It was a reminder that the past is not a monolithic entity, but a complex tapestry woven from countless individual threads, many of them invisible to the casual eye. You found yourself seeking out similar places in your travels, not necessarily to replicate the exact experience of the blackened barrel, for each tavern had its own unique character, its own local flavor, but to listen for the echoes of that same unwritten history. You would sit in a quiet corner, observe the patrons, listen to the cadences of their speech, try to catch the fleeting stories that swirled around the ale mugs. You were no longer just a traveler seeking refreshment, you were a student of these informal academies of human experience, a collector of these unwritten chronicles. The power of the Blackened Barrel, then, lay not just in what it was, but in what it represented. It was a symbol of resilience, of community, of the enduring human spirit. It was a reminder of the importance of those spaces where ordinary people could gather, share their lives, and briefly forget the burdens they carried. And it was a testament to the fact that history is made not just by the great and the powerful, but by every individual who lives, struggles, loves, and dies, leaving their faint but indelible mark on the places they inhabit. The oaken door, in your memory, became a gateway not just to a single tavern, but to a deeper understanding of the past itself. It was an invitation to look beyond the grand narratives, to seek out the hidden stories, to appreciate the profound significance of the ordinary. And in that, it offered a perspective that was both humbling and immensely enriching, a way of seeing the world that would stay with you, long after the last dregs of Boren's ale had faded from your palate. The unwritten chronicles were all around, waiting to be read by those with the patience to listen and the heart to understand. The Blackened Barrel had taught you how, Chapter 19, the legacy of the hearth and the taste of tomorrow. As time wore on, and your own journey accumulated more miles and more memories, the image of the great hearth in the Blackened Barrel began to take on a particular significance. It was more than just a source of warmth and a place to cook, it was the symbolic heart of the establishment, the focal point around which so much of its life revolved. The fire itself, constantly needing to be fed, tended, and eventually dying down to embers only to be rekindled, was a metaphor for the cyclical nature of life in the tavern, and indeed, for life itself. Each evening, it would blaze anew, drawing people to its light and warmth, fueling the conversations and the camaraderie. And each morning, it would be a pile of ashes, reminder of the night's passing, waiting to be stirred back to life. This rhythm of fire and ash mirrored the daily cycle of toil and respite, of hardship and fleeting pleasure, that defined the lives of so many of its patrons. The hearth was where food was prepared, the humble pottage simmering for hours, its aroma a constant, underlying note in the tavern's olfactory symphony. This act of providing sustenance, however basic, was a fundamental part of the tavern's role. It was a place not just to drink, but to be fed, to have one's most basic physical needs met. In a world where hunger was a constant threat for many, the promise of a hot meal, shared in the company of others, was a powerful draw. Around the hearth, stories were told, songs were sung, and the bonds of community were forged. It was the natural gathering place, the warmest and brightest spot in the dim room. Here, faces were illuminated, expressions more clearly seen, and the shared experience of the fire's glow created a sense of intimacy. Even among strangers. The old man dozing by the embers, the traveler drying his wet cloak, the group of friends sharing a joke, all were drawn to the hearth's primeval appeal. The legacy of that hearth, you realized, extended far beyond the physical confines of the Blackened Barrel. It spoke to a deep human need for a central gathering point, a source of warmth and light in a cold and often dark world. From the earliest campfires of ancient ancestors to the grand fireplaces of noble halls, the hearth has always been a symbol of home, of community, of shared human experience. Boren's grimy, smoke-stained hearth was simply one more link in this long, unbroken chain. And what of the taste of tomorrow? What did the future hold for places like the Blackened Barrel, and for the people who found solace within them? Medieval society was not static, it was constantly evolving, however slowly. New towns would rise, old ones would decline. Trade routes would shift. Wars and plagues would reshape the landscape. How would these changes affect the humble tavern and its patrons? Perhaps, in time, some taverns would become more refined, catering to a wealthier clientele. Perhaps new forms of entertainment would emerge, challenging the dominance of the storyteller and the dice game. Perhaps the very nature of community would change, as populations grew and social structures became more complex. Yet, you suspected that the fundamental human needs that the blackened barrel served, the need for sustenance, for companionship, for escape, for a sense of belonging, would remain constant. The forms might change, the names might be different, the ale might be clearer or the food more varied, but the underlying impulse to gather, to share, to seek solace in the company of others, would endure. The legacy of places like the Blackened Barrel was not just in the memories of those who had passed through their doors, but in the enduring human patterns they revealed. They were a testament to our social nature, our need for connection, our ability to find joy and meaning even in the most challenging of circumstances. As you looked towards your own tomorrows, towards the unknown roads and encounters that lay ahead, you carried with you not just the specific memories of that one night, but a deeper understanding of these timeless human truths. The taste of Boren's ale might have faded, the ache from the hard bench might have long since disappeared, but the lessons learned in the glow of that ancient hearth would continue to inform your journey. The oaken door of the Blackened Barrel had opened onto a world that was, in many ways, harsh and unforgiving. But it had also revealed a world of surprising resilience, of rough-hewn beauty, and of profound, if often unacknowledged, human connection. And that, you felt, was a legacy worth carrying, a taste of a truth that would resonate long after the fires of that particular medieval tavern had finally turned to cold, forgotten ash. The hearth may die, but the need for its warmth, in all its forms, is eternal. And in every shared drink, in every communal meal, in every gathering of souls seeking comfort and company, the spirit of the Blackened Barrel, and countless establishments like it, would live on. Chapter 20, The Unseen Scrivener and the Value of the Vernacular. The very act of recalling and reflecting upon your experience in the Blackened Barrel, of trying to capture its essence in thought and, perhaps one day, in written word, made you consider the role of the unseen scrivener, the silent observer who records not the grand pronouncements of kings, but the vernacular of everyday life. You were, in a small way, becoming such a scrivener, your mind the parchment, your memories the ink. In an age where literacy was a rare and precious skill, largely confined to the clergy and the nobility, the vast majority of human experience went unrecorded in formal texts. The language of the Blackened Barrel was not the Latin of scholars or the carefully crafted French of the courts, it was the robust, earthy, and often profane vernacular of the common people. It was a language rich in idiom, in slang, in expressions born directly from the realities of their daily lives, the toil in the fields, the dangers of the road, the camaraderie and conflicts of the tavern. To truly understand a place like the Blackened Barrel, you realized, one had to appreciate the value of this vernacular, to listen not just to the words themselves, but to the meanings, the emotions, the shared cultural understandings that lay beneath them. The shouted insults, the bawdy jokes, the mournful ballads, the muttered curses, these were not just noise, they were expressions of a worldview, a way of making sense of existence, a form of communication that was as vital and as nuanced, in its own way, as any learned treatise. The stories told in the tavern, whether by the bard or by the patrons themselves, were part of this vernacular tradition. They were often rambling, unpolished, and filled with digressions and exaggerations. But they were also alive, constantly evolving with each retelling, shaped by the audience and the teller. They were not fixed texts, but fluid performances, reflecting the dynamism of oral culture. These were the unwritten novels, the unrecorded plays, the folk wisdom passed down through generations, not on vellum, but on the breath of storytellers in smoky rooms. Boren himself, though likely illiterate, was a master of a certain kind of vernacular communication. His grunts, his gestures, the very set of his jaw, these conveyed meaning more effectively than any lengthy speech. His authority was built not on eloquent pronouncements, but on a clear, unambiguous understanding of the unspoken rules of his domain, an understanding shared by his patrons. The red-haired serving woman, too, wielded the vernacular with skill. Her sharp retorts, her quick-witted deflections, her ability to soothe a rising temper or encourage a generous tipper, these were all examples of a sophisticated command of language, adapted perfectly to the demands of her environment. She was a diplomat, a psychologist, and a comedian, all rolled into one, her stage the chaotic floor of the tavern. By witnessing these interactions, by immersing yourself in this world of spoken, rather than written, communication, you gained a deeper appreciation for the richness and complexity of oral culture. It was a culture that valued memory, quick wit, and the ability to connect with others through the power of the spoken word. It was a culture that was, in many ways, more participatory, more communal, than the solitary act of reading a written text. The unseen scriveners of this world were not just those who could read and write, but also those who listened, who remembered, who retold. The old woman sharing a folk tale with her grandchildren, the traveler recounting his adventures in an inn, the peasant repeating a piece of gossip heard in the market, these were all part of the vast, interconnected network that preserved and transmitted the vernacular culture of the age. Your own reflections, your attempts to capture the essence of the blackened barrel, were a way of bridging these two worlds, the world of oral tradition and the world of written record. By trying to articulate the sights, sounds, and emotions of the tavern, you were, in a sense, translating its vernacular into a more formal mode of expression. And in doing so, you hoped to preserve something of its unique spirit, to give a more lasting form to its fleeting, ephemeral realities. The value of this, you felt, was immense. For if history is to be more than just the story of the powerful, if it is to truly reflect the fullness of human experience, then the voices of the common people, the language of the tavern and the marketplace, must also be heard. The blackened barrel had taught you that these voices, though often rough and unpolished, spoke a profound truth about their time. They were the authentic soundtrack of medieval life, and the unseen scriveners, those who listened and remembered, were their most important chroniclers. Your night in that leaning, smoky establishment had, perhaps, nudged you a little closer to becoming one of them, tasked with recording not just facts, but the very feel and flavor of a world that was rapidly receding into the past, yet whose echoes continued to shape the present.